This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
Jonathan Alter is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, The Promise, President Obama, Year One, and The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. He is a weekly columnist for Bloomberg View. He spent 28 years as a correspondent, editor, and columnist for Newsweek, where he covered 7 presidential elections and authored more than 50 cover stories. He has a new book that will be coming out next year that will be published by Simon & Schuster. In his role at NBC News, he has appeared on The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and Meet the Press. On MSNBC, he's a regular guest on Hardball, Morning Joe, Andrea Mitchell Reports, and The Ed Show. Tonight, his address is entitled, Why the 2012 Election is the Most Pivotal of Our Lifetime. Please welcome Jonathan Alter.
Thank you so much. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. I'm very grateful to the Capps Center and to Santa Barbara, and I'm thrilled to be in this room. I was looking backstage a few minutes ago at some of the people who've appeared here over the years, over the last several decades. I'm not going to tell you as much about how to challenge Washington as Jimmy Stewart, star of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, did, but I might say a few more words than Marcel Marceau. So what I want to do is, I know there's some students here who are getting extra credit for showing up, which I appreciate. So I know one of the things that the students might want to hear, and some of the rest of you, is my take on what's going to happen. And I'm going to give that to you, but in abbreviated form. We can come back to it in the Q&A, but I really want to talk a little more historically tonight. And the truth is that even though I'm blabbing on TV like the rest of the talking heads about what's going to happen, the truth is none of us know. It's a little bit like people who tell you what's going to happen in the stock market. One of the things that makes it fun to cover is that like the NFL, on any given Sunday something can happen. So there are a number of Senate races that could go either way. I still believe, notwithstanding some polls, that the presidential race is winnable for Mitt Romney if he has a good month of October, and he can still win this thing in the stretch. My argument right now would be that President Obama has the edge. For many months, I was seeing it as a 50-50 race, and now I think it's more like a 75-25 race. But a 1 in 4 chance, still not too shabby if you're the challenger. And the reason that things are looking better for the president right now, beyond a lot of what's happened in the campaign, which I'll get into, is that the Electoral College map is really stacked in his favor. And so it's not a campaign about who gets the most votes, as we found out in 2000 when Al Gore got 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush, but did not get elected president. It's about getting to 270 electoral votes. And if Obama's lead holds up in, say, Ohio, which is really, I would argue, the pivotal state this year, then Romney really has to run the table in every other battleground state for him to win this thing. Now, I guess he could lose, one or two of the others, but he has to have almost a royal flush in order to get elected without Ohio. And the problem for him in Ohio is that unemployment, which is over 8% nationally, is only 7.2% in the state of Ohio. And we're all going to hear a lot about the auto rescue on Wednesday night because Mitt Romney knows, and he's already indicated that he's going to have to bring this up, that if he loses that argument, he will likely lose the election. His problem is that he doesn't have a very good argument. And the reason he doesn't have a very good argument is that facts can be stubborn things, and on that particular issue, the history of it is that Mitt Romney knows a lot about cars. His father was head of the American Motor Company, and when the auto companies started running into trouble, he wrote some very well-informed pieces about the travails of the auto industry. And he said a lot of things that were right about their bad management. He was an expert at Bain on bad management and in the companies that he was examining, and he identified the bad management in the auto industry. But he wrote an article in the New York Times, the headline that was not written by him, and his people are very bitter about this, very angry at the New York Times. The New York Times put a headline on it that said, "Let Detroit go bankrupt." But that's really not the nub of his problem, because the Obama administration put Chrysler and General Motors through a bankruptcy, as Romney will point out. They went through an ordered, accelerated bankruptcy in early 2009, and came out the other end. The problem that Romney has is that he said in that article and several times during the primary campaign that he didn't think that Washington should rescue the auto industry. Now, if you're speaking to a conservative Republican audience, that sounds good. Get big government out of there, no socialism. The problem is that there were no private investors who were willing to step up and invest in either Chrysler or General Motors. So it was the government or liquidation. There was no alternative. So Romney will try to argue, well, you wanted a bankruptcy. You did a bankruptcy, Mr. President. I wanted a bankruptcy. We both did bankruptcy. People are not well informed on that. But the president will come back and say, no, and it will get to this level of detail pretty quickly. You said that the government shouldn't step in, and there was nobody else to do it. So it was the government or liquidation. Now, 1 in 8 people in the state, 1 in 8 workers in the state of Ohio work in industries that are related to the auto industry. And the estimates are that the government bailout saved more than 1 million jobs in Ohio, Michigan, of course, which is Romney's home state and isn't even competitive, and other areas where the auto industry has a lot of suppliers and other companies that depend on it. So it's going to be both a philosophical and a job creation argument, and it will be hard for Romney to argue that he is the job creator and trained to be a job creator, which is his main calling card in running for president, that he created jobs in the private sector, if he was against these bailouts. Now, the other reason that that calling card has been so damaged is twofold. The Obama campaign did a very effective job of writing on that blank slate about Mitt Romney before Romney himself wrote on it. So a year ago, nobody really in the country knew much about Mitt Romney. They'd heard his name. Maybe they knew that his real name was Willard, but nobody wants to be called Willard, so he called himself Mitt. They knew that, and they knew his religion. They knew that he had been governor of Massachusetts, but they didn't know much more than that. He'd been successful in business. And so once the Obama campaign was able to bring out the fact that his success in business was not about creating jobs, but about creating profits, and drive home a very tough negative message on Bain, it made it harder for Romney to execute his basic argument. And in many ways, Romney was his own worst enemy. I mean, when they were running for president in 2007, he's getting ready to run for president the first time, you would think that he would arrange his financial affairs so that he didn't have Swiss bank accounts and money in the Cayman Islands. And he needed to make a basic decision about whether he wanted to be president or he wanted to squeeze as much profit as he could out of his holding and, jam $100 million into an IRA, which is not what IRAs were designed for when they were initially made a vehicle for middle-class savings. So he was leading with his chin in the way he arranged his financial affairs. And then he was too slow off the draw in making a positive case for why he should be president. In the Florida primary, Republican primary, 99% of the Romney ads were negative ads, mostly against Newt Gingrich. And arguably, he had to do a lot of that in order to fend off Gingrich and Santorum, but he didn't draw a positive enough picture. And so he placed all of his eggs in really three baskets: his vice presidential pick, which I'll get to in a little bit, the convention, and now the debates. And so far he's 0 for 2. Paul Ryan did not, give him a big lift. His convention got hijacked by a chair. So he just didn't do himself enough good. But he's got the wind at his back. So the polls today are that the race is tightening up. There's some new polls that show that it's a 2 or 3 point race, not a 4 or 5 point race. And that's because the president is sailing into a stiff economic wind. There hasn't been any president since Franklin Roosevelt in 1936 who's been elected with unemployment above 7.2%. So usually people vote their pocketbooks, and they have indicated that the economy is their most important issue. So if Obama wins, he will be defying history, and that's why I expect that this will stay a pretty close race. But he does have that advantage in the Electoral College, because it just so happens that a number of states that are doing better happen to be those so-called swing states. Now, why did I title this lecture, "This is the most important campaign in my lifetime"? The truth is that every 4 years, people running for president, they're all egotists at one level or another. They think their election is the most important election ever. And I've covered them all back to 1980, and they always say that. And I always, at that point, when they start saying it, I'm going, yeah, I've heard this. So why is this different? The reason that it's different is that the tectonic plates of American history are at a juncture now where they are rearranging, and depending on the results of the election, we'll either have a continuation of basically being a centrist government, or we will take a very sharp turn to the right. So I do believe that the stakes are, continuing on the current course or moving sharply to the right. Now, the reason a lot of Republicans believe this is the most important election of their lifetime is they think it's the last election before we become like Europe, more like a European system, and that Barack Obama is taking us down the road to socialism. And that's the word. They've done a very good job of implanting that idea. So I think it might be worth, I don't want to, I hope people in the audience liked history class and that they, enjoy thinking contextually about American history. Because I want to just take a little bit of a trip down, it's not memory lane, but through the history of the last 100 years. So in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, we lived in an era of rugged individualism. We had these robber barons, and they bought and sold members of Congress. Going back even to the middle of the 19th century, Daniel Webster was on the payroll of banks at the same time that he was in the Senate. Especially after the Civil War, it got really bad. And then we had a period of reform at the beginning of the 20th century. Theodore Roosevelt was probably the best known reform figure. He introduced some campaign finance reform. And in the Bull Moose Party platform of 1912, when he was an ex-president and he ran as a third-party candidate, did very well but didn't win. Woodrow Wilson ended up winning that election. But the first appearance of health care for the American people was exactly 100 years ago, 1912. And progressives believed that we should not be just subject to the whims of the marketplace, that sometimes the marketplace got out of whack, and it was the role of government, democratically elected government, to be a check on the excesses of the marketplace. And that seemed to be a pretty strong thread through most of the 20th century, and there was actually a lot of consensus about it. This also applied in a spiritual realm. Pope Leo, for those of you who are Catholic, you might remember reading about this. So he had a very famous encyclical in the 1890s that was pro-labor. It said that working people deserved a living wage, and that we were our brother's keeper, and it was partly the role of government to look out for people who couldn't look out for themselves. So much of the agenda took a very long time to complete, and then when in the 1920s, you saw a period that was kind of familiar to some of what we've seen, where the heroes in society were the presidents of companies, and everybody, it seemed, wanted to invest in the stock market. Then you had the stock market crash in 1929, and the New Deal starts in 1933 when Roosevelt's elected. He's not able to get health insurance, even though he wants it too much. Truman can't get it. Nixon tries it and can't get it. Obviously, Clinton tried it and can't get it. And this is where I get upset with some liberals who get kind of whiny. They didn't get everything they wanted in Obamacare. He got it done for the first time in 100 years. 100 years. So the question is, but part of what this election is about, is Obamacare a departure from American history, from the center, or is it in the American grain, as the historians want to say? Is it the natural conclusion? And for that, I go to the nature of this plan. It is not a single-payer plan like many liberals want it. It's a plan that resembles the plan that Bob Dole, those Bolsheviks, Bob Dole and Howard Baker, their plan from 1994 when they were putting up an alternative to Bill Clinton's plan. And then we all know Mitt Romney's plan in Massachusetts is almost identical to Obamacare. The same exchanges, the same insurance regulation, not as much cost control as Obamacare has, but a lot of similarities. So the idea that this is some radical departure is ahistorical. Because actually there has been this consensus, and the fact that Dole and Baker were for it is just one of many examples. And the consensus really goes back to the Civil War and the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. And he had been a Whig, and the Whigs were the party of internal improvements in the 1840s, 1850s, building canals, building roads. Today we have a fancy $50 word, infrastructure, but that was what their party represented. And then when Lincoln helped to, you make these internal improvements and you build your nation in part by the government investing in the future, investing in transportation, investing in education. So Lincoln, when he's president, building the railroad, infrastructure, land grant colleges, education, creates the Department of Agriculture. At the same time he's fighting the Civil War. Big government, right? But big government with a purpose to try to invest in the future of the country. And that consensus on infrastructure went all the way until 2011. 2011, when the president introduces the American Jobs Act, which can create more than 1 million jobs, and it has a lot of road and bridge projects in it, and every Republican's against it. He can't get to first base because something changed within the Republican Party. So for many years, or take something like public housing. Robert Taft, who was called Mr. Republican in the 50s, a very conservative Republican, he was the one who started public housing, first public housing. So they say that Ronald Reagan, local resident, Rancho del Cielo, right nearby. They say that today he would be considered a Republican in name only, a rhino, because his positions, whether it was raising taxes on several occasions, he cut them at first in 1981, then he raised them several times, or whether it was investment in infrastructure. He was within that consensus, and it would have been out of step with where the Tea Party and the balance of power in the Republican Party went. Now, there were always some very conservative Republicans, going back to the New Deal, and they opposed Social Security, the creation of Social Security in 1935. Now, I disagree with some liberals on this. I think that a lot of Social Security and Medicare is negotiable. There need to be changes. The present path is unsustainable with the retirement of the baby boomers. And Franklin Roosevelt was fine with that too. But there was one, and he was very amenable, and the Social Security Act of 1935 was disliked by a lot of conservative, a lot of liberal Democrats, because in the same way that a lot of liberal Democrats didn't like Obamacare, it was not a strong bill. It was a racist bill. It excluded any occupations that African Americans held. But Roosevelt's view, which was Obama's view, is you got to start somewhere with social insurance, and so let's go with this. So the Republicans in 1936, they all opposed it, and they got business to put in something saying, in their paychecks of their employees, the government's going to take your money through this payroll tax. Franklin Roosevelt wants to take your money. And Roosevelt ended up carrying all but 2 states. He was in a better position than Obama because the unemployment went down from 25% to 12%. And so, he wasn't sailing into a stiffer wind. But nonetheless, it was a validation of this idea of a safety net, Social Security. The one thing Roosevelt was very insistent on is that Social Security should never be subject to what he called the winds of chance, by which he meant the stock market, that it had to be a guaranteed return. And throughout the next decades, Reagan, other Republicans, Goldwater, they objected to Social Security, and they lost. Reagan lost 98-0. Bush tried to privatize Social Security in 2005. It didn't even come up for a vote. So you would think that at that point, this consensus that I talked about would be ratified, and we'd all agree, okay, there's certain obligations that the country has. And if you listen to the Republican candidates, of course I love Social Security, of course I love Medicare. Paul Ryan's got his mother down in Florida. But Paul Ryan was the floor leader for President Bush when he introduced his Social Security privatization in 2005. And Paul Ryan believes, as he has said, that too many Americans are in a hammock, as he calls it, a hammock of dependency. And we now know from this 47% business that Mitt Romney also, when he's behind closed doors, essentially believes in this culture of dependency. Now, there is something to that culture of dependency, as Bill Clinton recognized when he did welfare reform in 1996. But if you're hungry, if you're working and you're hungry, or you're not paying taxes, federal income taxes, because you're getting the Earned Income Tax Credit, which was originated under Reagan as the most powerful anti-poverty program of the last generation, which is to say to working poor, we're not going to tax you at the federal level. You're already paying a larger percentage of your income than Mitt Romney does in payroll taxes and sales taxes. So we're going to give you a break. We're going to encourage you to work by giving you this tax credit. If you start saying all those people are moochers, then you're going back to this philosophy that we know Paul Ryan considers to be the most important influence in his life, the Ayn Rand philosophy. She believed that society was divided between producers and moochers, makers and takers, and that the only people who deserved the respect of society were the makers. Now, they do deserve a lot of respect, and Obama messed up by making it seem, even though he was taken out of context, that he was being critical of people who started their own businesses. That was a terrible blunder in the way he framed that. But all that he was trying to say was he was talking about Abraham Lincoln-style infrastructure, roads and bridges. So when he said you didn't build that, he was talking about the roads and bridges that, people start businesses need. They need the commonweal, something from the commons, in order to be successful. Warren Buffett says this all the time, that if he had been born in a different country, he wouldn't have been a billionaire, because these other countries are not organized the same way to provide a sense of the public good and invest in the future in education. So, right now, where are we? The Republicans, and this will be a big subject on Wednesday night, they don't want to say what they would cut to pay for their 20% reduction in tax rates, or for their deficit reduction plans. They don't want to say what tax deductions they would eliminate, because many of them are very popular with the middle class and with the American voter: home mortgage deduction, charitable deduction. So they're being very vague about which deductions they would get rid of. And they're also trying to be vague about what they would cut. And this is where Paul Ryan comes in, because his roadmap for the future and his budgets, which passed twice passed the House of Representatives are quite specific. So we actually get a pretty good picture of what they would do if they were entrusted with power. And it's a very different country. It's a very different social contract. If you, for instance, cut $810 billion from Medicaid and block grant it to the states, and block granting it to the states, I don't want to get too far down in the sheep dip of policy here, but what that means is that the states can essentially use that money for a lot of different things, and what they would use it for would be a long-term care for the elderly, so that our parents and grandparents didn't have to move into the rec room. You know, they would use that to continue to provide long-term care for the elderly. So a lot of that long-term care for the elderly would be cut, but what would really take a hit, because the elderly are more powerful than the poor, is Medicaid for the poor. And you would have, you know, hospitals closing all over the country that depend on Medicaid in inner cities. And what you'd actually have, and this hasn't been raised much before, is you'd have a lot of people in the inner city who would be going to suburban hospitals and sitting in the emergency rooms there, which I'm not sure that the Republican voters in those communities will be thrilled about, should that come to pass. You also have just slashing college loans. Or, as Romney says, he wants to bring banks back in. He thinks it was wrong to have direct lending from the government to students, which freed up tens of billions of dollars in college loans, because without assuming any risk, the bank middlemen were pocketing billions and billions of dollars until early 2010, when when Obama got that change through. What does it do to, you know, cut student loans if fewer kids go to college? You might go, all right, well, that's their problem. You know, my grandfather had to work his way through college and figure out some way to get educated, whatever the line would be. Nowadays, if you don't go to college, you're screwed in America. The jobs all require at least some community college. And so to say that as a nation we're going to move in the opposite direction from investing in the future, the opposite direction of Lincoln and every Republican and Democrat all the way up. You know, a lot of Republicans voted for LBJ's aid to elementary and secondary education in the 60s. That we're going to move away from that, move in an opposite. Why as a nation would we want to do that? That's on the line in this election. So what I'm trying to do here is just try to give you, because there's a difference between kind of campaign issues, which sometimes can be pretty superficial, and then the real issues about the direction of the country. You know, so obviously repealing Obamacare, that happens right away. Romney has been very clear about that. They've already repealed it 31 times in the House of Representatives. If they get control of the Senate, which if Romney were to be elected, they will likely get control of the U.S. Senate as well. It would mean that they made a big comeback in October. Then they will use a process called reconciliation to get it through, the repeal through on 51 votes. Obama used reconciliation to get a lot of Obamacare through, if you remember, 51 votes. And so they'll repeal it with 51 votes too. Now you're going to hear in the debates, Mitt Romney's going to say, well, I still believe in the part about how you can't discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions. Sounds good. The problem is, and this is also at issue, is that you can't just have the good parts of Obamacare. If the insurance companies don't get the 30 million new customers, they can't keep the sick people on, you know, on their books. And then they have to go back to discriminating against people with pre-existing conditions. And the way they'll do it is the way they've done it in the past, which is if you don't have continuous care, if there have been any breaks, if you've been unemployed for any length of time, then they can keep you from buying insurance. They can discriminate against you. Now, I'm a cancer survivor, so for me it's kind of personal. The idea that, you know, I know firsthand what it's like. Fortunately, I had insurance, but the idea of, I used to think when I was very sick several years ago, what if I, you know, didn't go around making speeches and appearing on television and didn't have any money? On top of the cancer, I then have to figure out, how do I not sell my house to pay for my stem cell transplant that I had? Wow. That was a $500,000 transplant. All told, my whole care cost close to $500,000. I would have exceeded the caps. So you repeal Obamacare, then the insurance companies can then put lifetime caps. Suddenly, I got to come up with, I don't know, $300,000 or $400,000 to pay for my stem cell transplant. So that's on the line in this election. So there are big, big issues here. This is not Jimmy Carter versus Gerald Ford. They're basically both down that median strip, you know. And I don't even think it's Ronald Reagan versus, you know, Walter Mondale or Jimmy Carter, which was seen as this big transition. Reagan stuck with most of what government did. In fact, the size of government grew under Reagan. The Paul Ryan conservatives, and he's much more in tune with the Republican Party base than Romney is, but the base drives the train. And as we've seen all year, Romney, no matter what his own views are, I personally don't think he has any views particularly, except to close the deal. Like, he comes out of the business world where you say anything to close the deal, right? And then you negotiate after the deal is signed, and then you work out whatever problems arise. So he just wants to close the deal. But if he manages to close the deal and win the presidency, it will be the base of the Republican Party, which will feel totally vindicated. They'll feel, we had the weakest candidate in years, and we won anyway because the country loves us, and the country's conservative, and it is validated. By the way, not deficit reduction. These are not deficit reduction Republicans. The Ryan budget doesn't balance the budget until 2038. And as people like Tom Coburn, who's a true conservative, who was on the Simpson-Bowles Commission, he said, of course you have to have revenue increases, some tax increases if you want to move toward a balanced budget. And so the people who almost sent us into default, they're not budget balancers. They are small government conservatives, and their philosophy is summarized by a guy I went to college with, I've known for 35 years, Grover Norquist, who said, I want to make government so small that it can be strangled in a bathtub. And that is their ideological objective. And so, if we want to put our country on a course toward a radically smaller government, then that's something that people should be thinking about. But that's what they believe in, is a radically smaller government. Now, that kind of sounds good, because we all know there are lazy bureaucrats and people who make us crazy when we're getting our driver's licenses, and people who lose our Social Security checks, and, the private sector does do a better job of creating jobs. And, there's truth to the fact that government can get too big and too onerous. But the idea that somehow we were a stronger country when we had a very small government that did not do anything to take care of its people, did not invest in the future as much as we have in the last several decades. The idea that somehow that was a better America, I'm not sure stands up to historical analysis. Now, having said that, both sides are right that we need to do something to get control of the deficit, especially after we get through this period, so a kind of a two-step process where we continue to spend because you don't really cut spending, and you don't, in the middle of tough economic times, very few economists would endorse that. But then on a 5 or 10 year time horizon, you have $3 to $4 trillion cuts that Obama proposed last summer. And you can argue a lot about what the details should be. The Republicans have some good ideas. So everybody agrees that you move toward a kind of a rational deficit reduction. But that's different than moving to a small government agenda that rejects that eats our corn seed and rejects the premise that you have to invest in human capital through education and physical capital through infrastructure and all the other things that have been part of the American consensus for 150 years. I think with that, I'll segue briefly into the debates just to look a little bit ahead. I'm not confident enough to predict November, but maybe I can give you a couple of thoughts on what to expect on Wednesday. Could be wrong, and then open it up for some questions. The two candidates have two very different objectives. Romney needs zingers. He's behind, and he needs knockout punches, things that leave the president reeling. And so he's busy working on those. I'm not sure that the assumption behind that tactically is right, because the zingers might mobilize his base, and everybody likes to see the guy who's leading their ticket, land some shots. Democrats are always asking Barack Obama, land some punches. That's what they want to see. It can be very gratifying for your base. I'm not sure it does that much for the independents in the middle, the swing voters. He also has to show that he's interested in more than the 1%, because this 47% fiasco has really penetrated, and polls show that most Americans know about it. So he's going to need to try to show that he would be president of all the people. It's hard to get elected if you can't show that. Those two goals might be at odds with each other. If you're trying to land punches and also show that you're a unifier and that you want to be president of all the people, and you're up against a president who's popular and seen in polls as somebody you'd more prefer to have a beer with, you got to be a little careful with the zingers. So I think it's going to be very interesting to watch which Romney shows up. Is it the presidential Romney or the pugilistic Romney? We saw both of them in the Republican debates. But he got a lot of experience in those debates, and he wasn't bad. So the idea that he's going to trip over his shoelaces is not just wishful thinking, but it's also it suggests that the expectations game are working in his favor. And the history of these things is that challengers tend to win the first debate because they're on the stage with the president. And that in itself gives them a lift. It puts them up almost equal to the president. So the odds are that he will be seen as, he'll get at least something of a lift out of this debate just by showing up and doing reasonably well. The president needs to not just to seem strong and like a strong leader in control and willing to express that he has a better connection to the American people than Romney, which polls show that he does. So in that sense, play defense and emphasize his strengths. But he also has to walk a very fine line on the economy. In focus groups that have been done by the Obama campaign and by supporters of the Obama campaign, whenever the moderator of the focus group talks about things have gotten better, they're almost booed out of the room. People don't want to hear this kind of Pollyannish stuff about how things are so much better. Even if they're better for people who are in the stock market and their portfolios are worth twice what they were 4 years ago, for them the question of are you better off than you were 4 years ago is ridiculous. Of course they're better off. They're not, they haven't lost 2/3 of the value of their investments. They've recouped their investments. But for millions of people, they are really struggling. And for the president to put too much emphasis on how things have gotten better is potentially dangerous for him. And he knows this. And he knows he needs to introduce a note of humility and to always finish whatever point he's making on the economy with the line that, of course, things are not moving fast enough. Of course, we need to do better. And you hear him saying that, but he needs to sound those notes or he's going to get on the wrong side of a certain amount of the audience. So the stakes are high. The structure of the debates are that the Obama people insisted that there be no cheering sections because they didn't want it to turn out to be something where if Romney lands a line, he's better at one-liners than the president, who's kind of soundbite impaired. That there's cheering, and that was very unpresidential, and they want to create a kind of a presidential setting. So they insisted on that, and then they also insisted in their negotiations that the last debate be on foreign policy, which until now has been a strength for the president, as Joe Biden says, Osama bin Laden is dead and General Motors is alive, and what else do you need to know? So they want that foreign policy debate last. Now, they always have to worry about what's called an October surprise, and there was a bit of a September surprise with the killing of the ambassador to Libya. And you can expect to see Mitt Romney try to make hay of that issue, but he has to be careful on that. So the day after that happened, the next day he politicized that even before next of kin were notified, some of the other people who were killed, and that didn't play well for him. But anytime there's a foreign policy, possible mishandling of foreign policy, it gives him, the challenger, an opening to maybe score points as Reagan did against Carter in 1980. I think with that, I will, what do we have? We got about another 15 or 20 minutes, is that right? For some questions and comments, and come at me as hard as you can. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Robert Burke. Do you think the Supreme Court justices should be elected?
No. The question is, should Supreme Court justices be elected? The answer, to my mind, would be no. I actually come from Chicago, and in Illinois, judges are elected, and it politicizes things terribly. You have, an independent judiciary. I think that's like saying, should every issue be determined by a plebiscite of the people online? And I would be against that too. The founders didn't even have direct election of senators. They were elected by state legislatures until 1913. So I would be against that, but I might be for age limits on justices, a retirement age, because people are living so long now that life tenure in the 1780s meant something different than life tenure now. Most justices in the 18th and 19th and most of the 20th century, they died before they kind of, lost their marbles. And for them to be able to stay on the court as long as they want, I guess I would have a problem with. We haven't talked about the Supreme Court, but obviously the stakes are huge on all sorts of issues. My friend Jeff Toobin, who's just written a good book about the Roberts Court, says that he believes there is a very good chance of Roe versus Wade being repealed. And this is something that people have warned about for a long time, but the configuration of the court is such, with Sandra Day O'Connor gone, that it could happen even if Obama's reelected, because of if the right case comes up before the court, and there are a number of cases that are making their way through the process. It's most likely that Justice Ginsburg, who's been ailing some, although she's been doing better lately, she has had pancreatic cancer. If she's the first person to leave, if Romney's president, then they'd have a 2-vote margin, which would last a generation on all sorts of issues. On the other hand, if one of the conservative justices leaves, then you could see Citizens United reversed, and a lot of other ramifications. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us at the Capps Center. It's really exciting to see Lois Capps, the co-founder, here tonight to
Yes,
to hear you.
I'm so glad you reminded me of that. I saw Congresswoman Capps earlier, and I did not give her a proper shout out. Those of us who cover politics and Washington, it's not appropriate for me to make an endorsement, but let me just say that the United States Congress has few, if any. She is the equal to any member of the House of Representatives in terms of her values and her commitment and her ability to serve her district.
But I actually had a question. Like many people, I looked at Ayn Rand in junior high and high school and found the novels interesting, but from your Washington perspective, the fact that in her own life as a successful Hollywood screenwriter who was very wealthy and changed her name and reinvented her entire background, she did not practice any of the principles she articulated in her novels. How has she become such a powerful force so many years after she died?
Well, I guess the question is about Ayn Rand. As she said, it's Ayn rhymes with swine. She did have a little bit of a very dark sense of humor. I would answer your question with 2 words: arrested development. So there's a certain kind, we all, or many of us, read some of these books. They're mad boring. I actually couldn't get through any of them, to be honest with you. But I had friends who, and I pretended to read so I could be cool with a couple of my friends who got really into it. And in any group of well-educated younger people, there are going to be some who often really smart kids who go through an Ayn Rand phase, and then they move out of that phase. But you had Paul Ryan in 2007, I believe. I've got a part about this in my next book, and he goes to the Ayn Rand Society, the Atlas Society, it's called, and he gives a lecture about how she is a major influence on his life and on his thinking about the world. Full stop. It's Ayn Rand. Now, when it came out that he liked Ayn Rand, it was pointed out by people in his district that she was an atheist. So then he started running for cover, and saying, no. But this is really only a few years ago that he was in there, all in, with this just really awful philosophy of selfishness that elevates greed. At her funeral, she had a huge floral arrangement in the shape of a $sign about 10 feet high. And I encourage people to, just go to Wikipedia or something and learn something about this woman, because, if Romney and Ryan are elected, Ryan is a very clever guy, as Congresswoman Capps can say, and he will be a Dick Cheney-style vice president. A lot of the policy will be delegated to him on domestic policy, not foreign policy, because he doesn't know anything about foreign policy, but on domestic policy, we will get as close as he can get it to an Ayn Rand domestic policy. Yeah. I'm sorry, over here.
Hi. So I read the president said if he wins this election, then the congressional Republicans won't be focused on beating him and they'll be willing to cooperate. But I've also read that if Mitt Romney loses, the lesson that the conservative base will take was we weren't conservative enough again. How do you think that will actually play out in trying to govern our country?
This is a really central question, and I don't really know the answer to it, but I think it will be some of both. So conservatives will immediately, some of them are already distancing themselves from Romney, And they'll say, if only we had a real conservative, as if like Rick Santorum, would have won. But if only we'd had a real conservative. And there will be a lot of that, but then there will also be, you can see this also in the election right now, Richard Mourdock, who beat Richard Lugar in the primary in Indiana, is a Tea Party candidate. And he's suddenly saying, oh, he's independent. He's sounding like Scott Brown, I'm really independent, and I believe in cooperation and compromise. Remember, after the 2010 election, when John Boehner was asked on 60 Minutes, why don't you believe in compromise? And he admitted, he said, I don't like that word compromise, because it was so discredited in the Tea Party and in the Republican Party. I do think that if Obama wins, elections have consequences. And the message will be, hey, your way isn't very popular. It just got repudiated at the polls despite, massive unemployment. So you guys better get with the program a little bit with the American people, maybe even on the DREAM Act, certainly on deficit reduction. And also what will happen is, I think the most likely thing to happen is that they'll let the Bush tax cuts expire. So for a minute, everybody will have a tax increase, and then anything they do on taxes after that in January will be cutting taxes. And the Republicans will then be able to say, well, I voted to cut taxes on the middle class, even though cutting taxes for the wealthy at that point will not be on the table because, we need the $1 trillion for deficit reduction. So I do think that there is hope for some progress, and only Nixon could go to China, and this, I think, a really important kind of concept for those who are too young to remember this. In 1972, Nixon was this ardent anti-communist, and only he could open the door to communist China. If liberals tried it, it wouldn't have worked. And I think by the same token, only Obama can actually execute meaningful deficit reduction and whatever and entitlement reform, and whatever his missteps and mistakes on this, and we could go over them if you wanted to, in the last couple of years, whatever they were, he does have, if he wins, he would have an opportunity to get meaningful deficit reduction and some sort of reasonable changes in entitlement programs.